Welcome to the Helping Hands Way. People, lean, strategy. This is a podcast for nonprofit leaders doing real work with real teams, real clients, and real constraints. I'm Doug Rawson, Executive Director at Helping Hands Aurelia. In each episode, we share one practical play, how we approached a challenge, what we tried, what changed, and what we learned. No theory for theory's sake. Every conversation includes a playbook drop, a tool, template, or checklist you can adapt in your organization. Real work, real wins, the NFP playbook. We're back for our third podcast episode. We're joined with Joe Fecht, our board chair. And today's episode is all about strategic plans and the importance of strategic plans and how it helps your governance structure in providing questions and clarity. And we have one question really about today. It's about strategy and what we should stop doing and how it helps provide clarity and direction. Joe, welcome. Maybe we'll start with a little introduction.
Thank you, Doug. My name is Joe Fecht. I'm board chair for the last 6 years. I've been on the board since 2016 or 17, and I've been with the organization as a volunteer driver since 2015.
Thank you, Joe. And I can appreciate over time, there's been opportunities, there's been challenges. And today we want to really talk about from your lens as a board member and the board chair. What are some opportunities that other not-for-profits, whether it's a leader or a board, that they can take away from today's episode? And I want to talk a little bit about our strategic plan and how the strategic plan helps from the board's perspective about progress and decision-making and clarity. And maybe from your lens, Joe, we can start off with the importance of strategy and decision-making and how that framework is intertwined between board and operations and decision-making.
So in the last probably 40 years, every organization has looked at strategic planning. There's been a lot of consultants, a lot of input, a lot of boards trying to work on what a strategic plan looks like and how it affects the organization. And I've been involved in many of them with different organizations that I've been part of. I think the hardest part is not the developing of a plan, but it's how you operationalize the plan. But you have to go back to what is your board? Who makes up your board? How are the individuals that you recruit? What's their understanding of organizational structure and the need for a plan to move the organization from its current situation to its perceived future situation? And that sometimes requires some significant recruitment at a board level to ensure you have the right people thinking in the right way. Not that they all speak with one common voice, but they are ready to look at the organization with different eyes to move the organization forward.
Great, Joe. I really appreciated your feedback about operationalizing the plan and how the board makeup can really help to propel that plan forward. From your perspective, what are some important pieces that need to happen in order to operationalize that plan?
I think it's for the organization as a whole to embrace the plan. So it's not just the board, but it's the staff, the leadership team to understand what the plan is, and for the leadership team to identify some steps in realizing the strategic plan. One of the difficulties in many organizations is having a complete understanding of how the different parts of the organization function and how you have to bring all of those players together around an idea to move it forward. I think one of the challenges is often the strategic plan is developed and then there is no buy-in and it's just left with staff to somehow realize that strategic plan. I think as we have gone down this journey in Helping Hands, we had a strategic plan in 2015. It was done with a consultant. It provided a bit of a roadmap, but because of changes in board leadership, board membership, as well as senior staff changes, It just never got actualized. There never the objective steps to move it forward. So when we went around 2022 with finally hiring, I think, the right staff in the right positions, we're able to do a strategic plan that really had some legs. For every piece of the strategic plan, we called them pillars. We had steps, concrete steps to try to realize those strategic directions that we as an organization set.
Great. I appreciated the feedback, and a couple things resonated, Joe, when you talked about a plan to move the organization forward and embrace the plan with staff and leadership and how we can actually actualize that plan. What do you think was one or two of those key enablers that really helps to move the plan forward, like you mentioned, and to embrace the plan? What do you think were those big elements that someone listening can take away and say, that's something we need to pay attention to?
I think the first thing is more closely examining the culture that exists within the organization and some of the changes you need to make in order to move the organization in the direction that you want to. There's always in any organization when you're looking at change, and this is pretty radical change for an organization. You're moving from a model of volunteerism to a business model of running a non for profit in a number of directions that you've set. The difficulty often is there are many folks within the organization who don't buy into the new vision. And you could part of the having the vision is communication and meeting with staff and ensuring that they understand what you're trying to strive towards. I think from that kind of discussion with staff, you find out people who will never just support this vision. And it's time for the organization to move on and those individuals to look at other choices.
Thanks, Joe. So, as a board member, what are those elements that you feel from the strategic plan? And you've talked about some change management, you've talked a bit about culture. What are the things that helps the board in seeing progress, in seeing that the right direction and path forward is happening? What are those levers that you want to see from a governance perspective?
From a governance perspective, I would say what you need to identify is what is a board responsibility and what is a staff, a senior leadership responsibility. And I think this goes into all aspects of the organization. All too often, smaller not for profits under, I don't know, 3 to 5 million end up trying to have the board get involved in the actual administration of the organization. It is far too complex, far too much detail for any board member to have a complete understanding at that level. The idea is to have the oversight, and part of that is finding out what is the board's responsibility and what staff responsibility. So one of the issues is what kind of decisions have you delegated to staff in terms of spending, in terms of decision making around human resources, in terms of program delivery, and then also to identify what are the key metrics that you want to get from the staff for the board to understand that they're actually meeting the objectives of the organization that was set.
Joe, I think a lot of great points were brought up there. And I wonder if we can unpack some of it. And you really emphasize some aspects around board responsibility, operational responsibility, and you had some key elements from spending to decision making around programs and human resources. And I think that's really important and really good stuff. And I think it ties into two things. One, it changes the discussions that's happening at the board level, but it also adds clarity about what's appropriate and where should the board leverage their time and capacity and where should the operation staff put their responsibility. What do you think were a couple of those things that you saw that were implemented that helped with the board decision making and really the conversations that's occurring?
I think is engaging the board in discussions on various things. The authority chart that we've developed is very clear in terms of what the board should be informed on, what the board should be involved in decision making, what is the level of control in the organization, the level of authority in the organization as far as expenditures. That's one area. The other area is keeping board members from getting too invested in what's happening with individual staff persons. We've had a long history of some board members wanting to engage very deeply into an area that isn't their responsibility.
So, Joe, I appreciate you bringing up the board authority chart and how that helps to provide clarity, but also delegated authority for operation to be able to execute some of these key areas of responsibility that the board has felt from a strategic lens should be an operational versus a governance role. And this podcast is all about providing tools and resources to our listening audience. And our NFP playbook drop for this episode is going to be the board authority chart. This is a template and a guide that can help your organization add what's appropriate authority levels to your organization, but adds clarity. And this is a living, breathing document. Like you mentioned a minute ago, Joe, this can talk about HR, it can talk about spending, but this isn't a carved in stone. This is a living, breathing document that's meant to grow and foster over time, but adds clarity about where delegated authority for certain aspects of the organization rests. So that will be available in the show notes, and you can download that PDF for your utilization. Again, it is merely a template and a guide to help you with that. From my lens, Joe, I think it's an important document. I think it helps add clarity, but also adds clarity of communication and dialogue to be able to move aspect forward, as you mentioned, was about level of control.
So, in thinking further about this, I think one of the difficulties in an organization like ours is what is the board's mindset when it talks about a policy framework or working at a policy level, not at an operational level. When I joined the organization, it was, quotes, following a Carver model, which means that the only staff that the board has is the executive director or the chief executive officer, however you use that term in your organization. One of the difficulties was that I observed is that the board never really understood the details of what was happening in the organization and were not even open to hearing about some of the difficulties, some of the challenges, some of the opportunities. And I think that the problem was that they were almost resistant to get detailed information from staff to understand how well the organization was functioning. So, little things like being informed on your financial status, your profit and loss, and having the reports have key metrics that are timely so that you understand financially where your organization is and what some of the challenges are. And the other piece is a risk assessment, not just in terms of what's going well, but what are your vulnerabilities? Is it IT? Is it client safety? Is it, in our situation, say, transportation challenges? So if you don't get the right key metrics, key information from your staff, then you're, as an organization, the board doesn't have a handle on what's really going on, no matter what the strategic plan says. So it's key for the organization to keep in mind both the strategic directions, but also getting enough information back from staff to understand how that is being achieved and supporting that. I think one of the difficulties in many organizations is the relationship between the leadership on the board and the leadership on the staff have to be very complementary. Otherwise, it stalls the organization. You can't move forward very quickly.
Thank you, Joe.
If this episode's providing value, if it's helping you think differently or apply something in your own work, consider supporting our mission. You can make a charitable donation at helpinghandsorillia.ca/podcast. Your support helps us continue doing the work and sharing what we learn.
Joe, you talked about a lot of good information and really about timely information. You talked about confidence in the numbers. You talked about financial data. You talked about understanding the difficulties and the challenges. You talked about resistance to change. And you also talked about, the difference from policy to organizational implementation. And as these tools, as the relationships are formed, as the trust is built, and as you have confidence with the data that you've talked about from risk register to board authority chart, how do you find the conversations have changed at the board level? How do you find the strategic thinking has changed and what organizations can do to foster that?
I think a couple of things. One is that there is a greater confidence in amongst board members themselves in terms of their own leadership and their own role as a board director, and that's important that all of the board members are on the same page. The second piece, I think, is that when you develop the kind of trust that you need in an organization to make changes, the accurate information, the confidence in that the strategic plan is being implemented creates further clarity as to what is the board's role and what is the staff's role. And as you move through this journey, it becomes clear that sometimes changes happen at a board level or at an operational level that you wonder at the board level, okay, is this a challenge? Is this something we need to explore further? I think it's really good that you can have individuals on a board who want to question something and leave room for that opportunity to be explored and to get staff engaged to give you the information that you require if you have a specific concern. So it's all about communication in a timely way. It does occasionally take excessive time at a board meeting, but it's the kind of thing that you need to focus on if there isn't complete consensus on an issue.
Joe, a little while ago, you talked about strategic plan. You talked about our strategic plan has pillars, and those are key operational elements that the organization wants to focus on. And today we've talked a little bit about culture. We've talked about the dynamics of change and change management and having clarity about where it is we want to go. And you talked about the importance of actualizing results really attached to those pillars. Often in not for profits, we tend to focus a lot of support to community. And from my perspective, when we rolled forward our strategic plan, we wanted clarity about where we should be, where we should not be. And I think strategic plans is really about making strategic choices and where we should be providing impact to community. From your perspective, from a board lens, how does a strategic plan help operationalize opportunities for the organization? And do you find it unlocks other opportunities with the clarity of where we should be going?
Thanks, Doug. I think from my perspective, it depends on where your organization is at. We have an agreement with the Ministry of Health to provide a certain level of services. And I think the main focus initially, if you are funded with any kind of a government, provincial government agency, is to ensure that you meet the requirements that you have in the legal agreements that you've signed and deliver those deliverables and be accountable. The difficulty is when an organization wants to achieve greater than the baseline that the ministry wants you to achieve in your service delivery goals. That has financial implications for an organization and human resource implications for an organization. But if you've got that under control, then one of the key issues in strategic planning is you've got your internal house in order. Then you can start looking more externally in your community to see how you can form partnerships, how that would potentially affect your organization in terms of services and resources, both human and material, and look at new opportunities for expansion of services that augment what you're already doing. I mean, I think you still need to be fairly clear that you're staying in your laneway and not trying to move the organization in a completely different direction outside of your framework and outside of your strategic plan.
Amazing. Joe, as we look back in time, there will be people listening to this and want to see how they can make impact and how they can make impact with their strategic plan and how their governance structure can support their operations and their leadership team. What one piece of advice would you provide to that organization on how they can support the organization moving forward, but from the governance lens? What's the one takeaway you think would most propel them forward?
That's a difficult question. I think it's at the beginning, at the start. You need to have a strategic plan that is developed with your staff and your board together in a room. It takes time, it takes energy, and it can be tiring after a long day or 2 days or even 3 days. But you come up with a plan that sets the direction. You have to invest that initial energy to make sure that everybody's voice is heard, that everybody's clear on what the organization's responsibilities are in terms of their agreements, and what are the key next pieces that need to be addressed in the organization. It could be 3 things, it could be 4 things, it could be 6 things. I'm not sure that any organization can handle any more than 5 or 6 major directions. But I think as you meet as a group, you will slowly develop what are those key things you need to address. And that will form the basis of your strategic plan.
Joe, some really good feedback for everyone to hear about the importance of adding clarity and adding clarity with strategic plan and really taking the time to invest together as board and staff, getting together and putting the effort forward to create some clarity on creating a plan. And I appreciate that feedback. I wonder if you can give another lens of the plan's been established, the direction's been established, the clarity and what we want as the end goal. How else can the board support the implementation, adoption, and the realization of the strategic plan?
As the board moves forward from a singular unit, you start delegating some responsibilities in a more concerted effort in its various oversight functions. This could be a financial committee, a governance committee, it could be a client risk committee. It's having an understanding in terms of your staff and in terms of your organization as to the areas that you want to focus on, but you don't have enough time at a board level to go into that level of detail. That's why you have standing board committees and occasionally some ad hoc committees if you have a specific issue that needs addressing that isn't immediately clear as to what direction you should take as a board.
Thank you, Joe. This has been a lot of fun, and we've covered a lot of, I think, important first steps in creating a plan, in creating the structures, and creating the processes to move things forward. And I think we've only scratched the surface of the relationship of staff and leadership and our governance model and our leadership. Closing comments and any parting takeaways that you want to end with.
Well, for many board members, some have some board experience and others have minimal board experience. It's important as you move the organization forward as a chair is that the new members who join the board are welcomed, that they get a complete understanding of the organization and what is the functions of a board. We've received a lot of feedback over the years, and as a result, we've developed a manual to help new board members come to understanding their full responsibilities. I think the other key piece is make sure when you're doing your recruitment of staff that you spend the time and the energy to make sure you have the right staff in the right positions. And as a board, that primarily is your ED or chief executive officer. That is fundamentally important in setting the direction of the organization. And developing a strong relationship between the board and the leadership team. That's important so that as you move forward and face combined challenges, that you have the confidence, that you have the communication so that there aren't any impediments to moving forward. When we go back to the Carver model, as it was presented, was very much an approach of being hands off the operations. And I think the mistake is that often board members don't understand that they need information to carry out their responsibilities as board members, having oversight of the organization, because the board does sign off on its accountabilities to the funder. And so that the board needs to have information. It's not hands off, it's being informed about how the organization functions.
Thank you very much, Joe. Again, I think this was great. And we will have you back for more conversations about the board and its relationship with leadership and operationalizing some of these things that we've talked about today. So thank you for sharing. And I want to thank you for your contributions and your commitment to not just our organization, but for not-for-profit sectors, social services, and community support services. From my perspective, your support and the board support wouldn't have been possible to operationalize half of the things that we brought forward today. So thank you again for being with us today on this third episode and for helping to share some of the context around governance and leadership and strategic planning, setting the direction, the tone. I appreciate our relationship. I appreciate the support. Next time, our next episode is all about navigating care together. And we're going to bring in a client's perspective that really talks about designing access that works and where barriers can actually create more challenges and opportunities. So until then, thank you and have a good day.
It's been a pleasure, Doug.
Thanks for listening to the Helping Hands Way, People, Lean, Strategy. If today's episode was useful, you'll find the playbook drop, templates, or tools mentioned linked in the show notes. If you're a nonprofit leader navigating similar challenges, share this episode with someone on your team or in your network. And if you want to keep learning with us, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Real work, real wins, the NFP Playbook.